Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the rise of populism and its impact on democracies.
Oh, yeah.
And to get into this, we're going beyond just kind of like at an article from the Politics and Rights Review. And the authors are
Okay.
Armin Schaefer and Michael Zern. Schaefer is a professor of political science at the University of Mainz.
Okay.
And Zern directs global governance at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. He's also a professor of international relations at the Free University Berlin.
Wow. So these guys really know their stuff.
Yeah, they're definitely experts in this field.
Right.
And one of the things that really stood out to me as I was reading this article is the way that they frame the issue. They argue that populism isn't just some random phenomenon or a blip on the radar. Gotcha.
It's actually a direct response to like some pretty fundamental problems within democratic systems themselves.
So not just kind of a surface level thing.
Yeah, they're saying it's a symptom of something deeper.
That's interesting.
Right. So it's not just about like charismatic leaders or economic anxieties.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, right?
Exactly.
But it sounds like there's something more fundamental going on.
They think so, yeah. And they start by highlighting this thing they call the perception gap.
The perception gap.
Okay. And this is basically the idea that most people in Western countries say they support democracy, like in theory.
Right. Everyone loves democracy.
Yeah. But when it comes to how it's actually working in practice, they're incredibly dissatisfied.
Yeah. You see that in the polls, right?
Exactly. People believe in the concept, but they don't really feel like it's working for them.
Yeah. I can see that.
So why is there this disconnect?
Right. What's going on there?
Well, the authors point to a few key factors.
First, there's this widespread decline in trust in institutions.
Oh, yeah.
Like parliaments, political parties, even politicians themselves.
Yeah, you don't really trust those guys.
People just don't feel like those systems are serving them anymore.
Like they're out of touch.
Right. It's like a growing sense that the system is rigged.
A lot of people feel that way.
And then along with that comes this feeling of powerlessness.
Okay.
People feel like their voices don't matter. And they can't actually influence decisions.
It's like no matter who you vote for, nothing really changes.
Exactly. So it's not just cynicism. It's a feeling of being shut out of the process.
Wow, that's a good point.
And this feeds into a sense of disillusionment with representation itself.
Okay.
Like people want parliaments to reflect the will of the majority.
Right. That's the ideal.
But they don't see that happening.
Yeah. Doesn't always seem that way.
So they start to question whether their vote actually counts.
I can see how that would lead to problems.
And all of this creates this vacuum that populism can step into.
Ah. Okay, so it's like populism is filling a void.
Exactly, and we'll get into that a bit later.
Okay.
But before we do, the authors do address those, like more common explanations for populism.
Right.
Economic anxieties, cultural backlash, all that.
Yeah, those are kind of the go-to explanations, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So what do they say about those?
Well, they acknowledge that,
like,
globalization has had a real impact on jobs and livelihoods, especially for people who feel left behind by tech changes and things like that.
Sure.
And they also recognize that, rapid social and cultural shifts can be disorienting or even threatening to some people.
Makes sense. It's like the world is changing too fast.
Right. It's like the ground is shifting beneath their feet.
Yeah. And they're looking for something to hold on to.
Exactly. But here's where Schaefer and Zern kind of take a different approach.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting.
They argue that these factors, while important, don't fully explain the rise of populism.
So there's more to it.
They think so.
Okay.
They believe that the real root cause is a deeper political crisis.
A political crisis.
A crisis of democracy itself.
So they're saying it's not just about economics or culture.
Right.
It's about democracy itself failing to work as it should.
That's the core of their argument.
Wow, that's a big claim.
And they identify two key mechanisms that are eroding democratic responsiveness.
Two mechanisms.
And we can kind of unpack those.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, so what's the first one?
All right, the first mechanism.
They call it the rise of non-majoritarian institutions.
Non-majoritarian institutions, okay.
And these are institutions like central banks, constitutional courts, or even international organizations like the EU.
So these are powerful entities that aren't really accountable to voters.
Exactly. And to be fair, the authors acknowledge that there are often good reasons to give these institutions authority.
Sure. I mean, governments can be short-sighted.
Exactly.
Sometimes you need that long-term perspective.
And they can offer expertise, stability,
Yeah.
a longer-term perspective.
Right. It's like a trade-off between efficiency and accountability.
Exactly. But the problem is that as decision-making power shifts away from elected officials and towards these unelected bodies, it erodes accountability.
Right. Because then people don't really have a say.
Exactly. Citizens have less say in policies, and that fuels that feeling of powerlessness.
So even if you vote for change, those votes might not mean anything.
Right.
That's frustrating.
And the authors bring up the Greek financial crisis as an example.
Oh, yeah, that was a mess.
Remember, even when elections brought in a new government, their hands were tied?
Right, because of the EU and stuff?
They had surrendered so much economic power to these international institutions that they couldn't really enact their agenda.
That must have been so frustrating for Greek citizens.
It was a major source of discontent.
I bet.
And this trend towards non-majoritarian institution, while it might have some benefits, contributes to that feeling that democracy isn't truly responsive.
Right, to the will of the people.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this rise of unelected bodies making decisions. What's the second mechanism they talk about?
So the second one focuses on parliaments themselves.
Okay, parliaments.
Even when parliaments do have power, the authors argue that they're often biased.
Biased
towards the wealthy and well-connected.
Ah, so it's not just who's making the decisions.
Right.
It's whose interests are being represented.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And they cite research showing that in both the U.S. and Europe, policies tend to reflect the preferences of the rich more than the poor.
Even when those preferences clash.
Yeah.
Wow. That's pretty damning.
It undermines that whole idea of one person, one vote.
It really does.
And they point to a few factors that contribute to this.
Okay, what are those?
One is campaign financing.
Right.
The need for politicians to raise tons of money makes them beholden to wealthy donors.
It creates this system where they have to cater to the elite.
Exactly.
Not the everyday person.
And then there's the composition of parliaments themselves.
Okay.
They're often overrepresented by certain groups.
Like who?
Men, university graduates, people from privileged backgrounds, and underrepresented by working class people, minorities, other marginalized groups.
So the people making the decisions don't actually reflect the people.
Exactly.
That's a problem.
And then there's the rise of the career politician.
Career politician?
Career politician.
People who have spent their entire careers in politics.
Oh, okay.
Often moving from one government position to another.
So they're kind of like institutionalized?
They might prioritize party loyalty.
Over their constituents? Yeah, they become more concerned with maintaining their position
than actually serving the people.
And here's another point that the authors raise that's really important. Even when parliaments don't make decisions, that inaction itself can be a form of bias.
How so?
Think about it. If the status quo already favors certain groups, then doing nothing just reinforces those existing power structures.
So even when it seems like nothing's happening, there are still winners and losers.
Exactly. And the winners are usually those who are already in power.
Right. The privileged.
So we have these two mechanisms at play. Unelected bodies gaining power and parliaments that may not be truly representative or responsive to the needs of the people.
It sounds like the authors are building a pretty compelling case here.
They are.
Okay.
And next we'll explore how all of this feeds into the rise of populism itself.
Looking forward to it. Okay, so we've been talking about these kind of like cracks in the foundation of democratic systems.
Yeah, and those cracks create the perfect conditions for populism.
Exactly. Schaefer and Zern really highlight populist parties. They kind of exploit this gap between, like the ideals of democracy and the reality that so many people are actually experiencing.
It's like a gap between theory and practice.
Right. And they position themselves as like the voice of the forgotten majority.
The people who feel ignored.
Exactly. The people who feel ignored by the elite.
And betrayed by the establishment.
Yeah, which is a powerful message.
It is, especially when you feel like your concerns aren't being taken seriously.
Exactly. And they tap into that by promising to shake things up.
Drain the swamp.
Yeah, that kind of rhetoric.
It's appealing.
Yeah, it's a simple solution.
We're on your side, we'll fight for you.
Right, and it seems like a shortcut
Yeah. Irony is that this appeal works because of democracy's flaws.
Yeah.
But populism itself doesn't actually offer a real solution.
In fact, it often makes things worse.
And that's where the populism trap comes in.
Right. That's what they call it.
Exactly. The populism trap.
So what is that?
It's this idea that populism might gain power by exploiting these democratic discontents.
Yeah.
But ultimately it ends up undermining the very system that it claims to champion.
So it's like a self-defeating cycle.
Yeah, in a way.
So what happens when populists actually get into power?
Well, the authors have some pretty sobering examples.
Like what?
They point to countries like Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Venezuela, where populist leaders have basically chipped away at democratic norms, institutions.
Give me some specifics.
Okay, so you see attacks on the judiciary, suppression of opposition parties.
Right. Attempts to control the media. Yeah. Even changing electoral laws.
Wow.
To give themselves an advantage.
So it's like they're trying to rig the system.
In a way, yeah.
So they can't lose.
It's about holding on to power.
Even if it means sacrificing democratic principles.
That's a key part of this populism trap.
And what's really worrying, that populists tend to be sore losers.
Oh, yeah.
It's that us versus them mentality makes any defeat seem like an existential threat.
Like the whole system is collapsing.
Not just a difference of opinion.
Because they believe they represent the true will of the people.
So any loss must be illegitimate.
Right, exactly. And that makes it hard for them to accept defeat.
Yeah, you see this a lot.
If they lose an election, they cry foul.
They claim fraud.
Even without evidence.
And this can lead to violence sometimes.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game.
It is.
And this leads to what the authors call populist authoritarianism.
Populist authoritarianism.
And this is what happens when populists gain power and then start to dismantle the institutions that brought them there.
So populism could actually lead to the erosion of democracy.
That's the danger.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Populism exploits discontent.
Right.
Gains power. Erodes democracy.
Yeah.
Which creates more discontent.
It strengthens populism.
It's a trap.
It's a hard trap to escape.
So how do we get out of this trap?
Well, Schaeffer and Zern argue that we have to address the root causes.
The underlying issues.
Yeah, that make democracy vulnerable to populism.
So it's not enough to just warn people about populism.
Right, we have to do more than that.
We have to actually fix the problems.
Exactly.
So non-populist parties and leaders need to offer a real alternative.
A vision for how to renew democracy.
To close that perception gap.
Right, to make democracy actually work for people.
So it's not just about criticizing populism. It's about offering a better solution.
Exactly.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, that's a big question.
And one that we'll dig into next time.
I'm really curious to hear more about that.
So we've spent a lot of time in this deep dive looking at how the rise of populism is tied to all these problems within democratic systems.
Yeah, like we said, it's not just a surface level thing.
Right. There's some deep-seated issues here.
But the question is, what do we do about it?
How do we actually address these problems and make sure that democracy can withstand the dangers of populism?
Where do we even begin?
Well, Schaeffer and Zern, they suggest a multi-pronged approach.
Multi-pronged, okay.
Basically, they argue that we need to close that perception gap.
Remember that.
Right, that gap between the promise of democracy and the reality that so many citizens experience.
Right. They don't see those matching up.
Exactly. So non-populist parties and leaders.
Okay.
They need to stop just reacting to populist rhetoric.
Right, not just playing defense.
And instead actually offer a real alternative.
Yeah, a positive vision.
A vision for how to make democracy work.
For the people.
So it's about being proactive, not just reactive.
Okay, so what might that actually look like?
What are some concrete steps?
Well, they highlight a few key areas that need reform.
Like what?
One is campaign financing.
Right.
You know, we need to reduce the influence of money in politics.
So that elected officials are more accountable to their constituents?
Exactly, not to wealthy donors.
It's about leveling the playing field.
Making sure everyone's voice is heard.
And they also talk about making parliaments more representative of the population as a whole.
Right, like actually reflecting the diversity of the people.
And that might involve things like electoral reforms, quotas for underrepresented groups.
Sure.
Maybe even changing how candidates are selected.
Okay, so that's parliaments.
What about those non-majoritarian institutions?
Ah, right. The central banks, the courts.
Yeah. The authors believe we need to increase transparency, accountability in these institutions.
So people have more say in how they operate.
Right. Finding that balance between expertise and accountability.
It makes sense.
And then, of course, we have to address those economic and social anxieties
that make people susceptible to populism in the first place.
That means investing in education, job training, strengthening social safety nets, and promoting policies that lead to a more equitable distribution of wealth.
So basically, creating a more just and fair society.
It's about creating a sense of shared prosperity.
Yeah, so everyone feels like they have a chance.
And ultimately, it's about restoring faith in democracy itself.
That it can actually work for people.
This deep dive is really insightful.
A lot to think about.
We've seen how the rise of populism is really a symptom of these deeper issues.
Within democracy.
But like you said, it's not an unsolvable problem.
There are solutions.
There are.
They might be complex.
Yeah. And they require a long-term commitment. And the authors leave us with a question.
Okay.
What do you think needs to change?
To make democracy work better.
In the 21st century.
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
Because the future of democracy might depend on finding those answers.
That's a powerful thought.
It's a call to action for all of us.
Yeah.
If you're concerned about democracy, don't just sit on the sidelines.
Get involved.
Engage in the debate. Get involved in your community.
Make your voice heard.
Advocate for the changes you believe in.
Right, because democracy is an ongoing project.
It requires all of us to participate.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning.
Stay curious.
And keep striving for a better world.